For my reading this morning, I've chosen a little passage from John's Gospel in chapter 14 and a piece from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 11. From John, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works that I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father." And from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Words inspired by God. April 1st this year is the feast of Holy Thursday. And typically when we think of Holy Thursday, we think that it was the occasion on which Jesus instituted two sacraments, the Sacrament of Eucharist and the Sacrament of Priesthood or ordination. I actually believe that there were three sacraments instituted on that occasion. There was indeed the Sacrament of Eucharist, and there was the Sacrament of Ordination, but there was also the Sacrament of Service, in which he washed the feet of everybody present. Now, as I think about it, I don't believe it was so much that Jesus instituted new sacraments as much as that he transformed existing sacraments from his own wisdom Jewish tradition. And so Eucharist is a transformation of the Seder meal, celebrating the escape of from Egypt of the Israelites in slavery. And if that kind of celebrated their physical freedom, he transformed that into an understanding of our psychological and our spiritual freedom. And where the priesthood existed in the lineage of Aaron, all of Aaron's lineage became the priest, the Kohanim of Judaism. And Christ is transforming that into the priesthood of everybody, that every single one of us is a priest. We're an incarnation of the divine. And he's transforming the sacrament of service, which in all previous societies was a pyramid scheme in which the lower levels of the pyramid served the higher levels, who had served the higher, until finally there was some group at the top who were being served by everybody. And he transformed that by washing the feet of his own disciples. He turned the pyramid upside down. And so in some senses, there are three sacraments there, and it's the transformation of existing understandings in his own wisdom tradition. He wasn't creating something ex nihilo. Now, for the last two Sundays, I've been looking at the Sacrament of Eucharist and the Sacrament of Priesthood. And since this is the third Sunday of the month, I'm going to do a recap on what I've said in the last two Sundays, and then open it up for question and answer discussion. So that's where we'll go this morning. So on March 7th, I looked at the notion of Eucharist and my understanding of what Eucharist is. And I distinguished between three things, between what I call a sign, a symbol, and a sacrament. And for me, a sign is one physical thing standing for another physical thing, like a road sign. A road sign is a piece of metal with paint on it, indicating that further on, there's going to be a road, a piece of tarmac that you're going to hang a right or a left or whatever. So a sign is simply one physical thing standing for another physical thing. A symbol is different. A symbol has one foot in the physical and the other foot in the metaphysical. And so I give you the examples, for instance, of the custom, at least in Europe at least, of tipping your hat when you meet somebody. And this goes way back when knights had suits of armor on, including a visor that covered their face. And in order to reveal who they were, they would tip the visor back so people could see their faces. So that's the relic of that is just tipping your hat. So here I am, you recognize me. I'm not an enemy figure. And I give the example of a handshake. And the handshake goes back as well to a time when the weapons of choice were either a pistol or a dagger. And so since 95% of people are probably right-handed, when you met somebody and you wanted to impress upon them that you weren't an enemy figure, you were a friend, you extended your weapon hand and said, "Look, I don't have a weapon." and the other person would extend their right hand, and you'd hold hands or shake hands. So shaking hands was an indication that I'm not coming bearing weapons. I'm a friend of yours. And I gave the example of a kiss. A kiss has one foot in the physical, lips meeting lips or lips meeting cheek, and the other is the metaphysical, I'm your friend, I come in friendship. So the symbol then always has one foot in the physical and the other foot in the kind of the metaphysical. But a sacrament then is a very special kind of symbol because it actualizes that which it symbolizes. A signpost can be made to tell a lie. You can go to a crossroads in Ireland, with 4 fingers pointing in 4 directions and just twist the whole thing around, and somebody who comes is going to be misdirected. So a sign can tell a lie. And a symbol can tell a lie, like Judas kissing Jesus, which was a lie. And so symbols can be made to tell lies, but sacraments can never lie, for the simple reason that it is the awareness and the mindfulness behind the symbol that creates a sacrament out of the symbol. And so it's the mindfulness and the awareness. 2 people come up for communion together, and one person is a million miles away and just sticks out her tongue and gets a piece of bread on her tongue. All that happened is she got a piece of stale bread on her tongue. Somebody else comes up with total awareness and realizes that this is a divine encounter with Christ consciousness. And the piece of bread is merely symbolic of the altered state in which she has a real encounter with Jesus. So sacraments cannot lie. They're on a spectrum. The level of your awareness is the level of the effectiveness of the sacrament with which you're engaging. And it's all the ways from, you're mindless completely and you get a piece of bread, or you're totally present and you have an encounter with the risen Christ. So that was the first point I made, signs, symbols, and sacraments. Then I went on to talk about the Mass and the 2 parts, the liturgy of the word and the liturgy of the act. And to remind us that in our community of COJ, for the liturgy of the word, we utilize all the great wisdom traditions. We're taking our sacred readings from all the scriptural traditions, whether it's the Judeo-Christian model or the Pitakas of Buddhism or the Upanishads, whether it's mythology, our folklore, our proverbs, our art. We take our inspiration from all the traditions during our liturgy of the word, because God speaks as powerfully, I believe, through African folklore or through Irish mythology as she does through the Judeo-Christian scriptures. And so then we have to realize that when we're engaging with the word of God in these formats, there are 3 levels at which it can be unpacked. There is the literal level, there's the symbolic level, and there's the mystical level. And I give you an example. I talked about the Transfiguration of Jesus about a week before he died. Now, where he takes Peter, James, and John, and they go up to the top of Mount Tabor and have an encounter with Moses and Elijah. Now, Moses was dead 1,250 years at this stage, and Elijah was dead about 850 years. So a literal translation of that, or a little unpacking, would suggest that Jesus, Peter, James, and John went up to an actual mountain and they had an encounter with 2 ghosts, Moses and Elijah. That would be a literal unpacking of this story. A symbolic unpacking would be the fact that Moses and Elijah represented the 2 parts of the Jewish scriptures, the law and the prophets. Moses gave the law, Torah, and Elijah is the first of the prophets. So you could say symbolically, it is Jesus encountering the totality of his own wisdom tradition before as he begins the last week of his life. Or you could go about it symbolically and say that this was actually Jesus accessing his higher self or his soul self. And that in fact, it was a dress rehearsal for resurrection. That what happened to his body and his clothing even, that were transformed and transfigured, was a dress rehearsal for what would happen at the end of the next week when he resurrected from the dead, and imprinted on the Shroud of Turin, the impact of his radiated body. So you could say that would be the mystical interpretation of it. I went on then to talk about the liturgy of the act, and to say that very, very often the disciples only recognize Jesus during a ritual. There's the great story you find in Luke's Gospel on the road to Emmaus on the Sunday of Resurrection, when there are 2 disciples walking on the road and Jesus walks behind them and he catches up with them. He says, "What are you talking about?" And they'll go say, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's been happening there for the last few days?" He says, "What happened?" And then they begin telling him about the last 3 or 4 days. They don't recognize him. And indeed, Mary of Magdala, his beloved, didn't recognize him according to John's Gospel. So when do they recognize him? They reach the village of Emmaus, and then Jesus pretends he's going to go on further. They say, no, stay with us. It's nearly nightfall. Come and break bread with us. And they go into a little inn, and they order the food, bread and wine, and Jesus takes it, and they say to him, say the bracha. And they're expecting he'll say, bracha ta Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, amen. Instead of that, he engages in a ritual that opens their eyes, and they celebrate, oh my God, it's he. So very, very often, it's in ritual that you recognize the Christ. And for that reason, ritual is really, really important. Ritual properly done creates an altered state of consciousness. It activates the imagination. And I've differentiated many, many times for you between imagination and mere fantasy. They're totally different. Fantasy is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift your state of consciousness, enter into different dimensions, encounter entities and energies in those other spaces, interact with them, learn from them, and then come back into this ordinary state of consciousness and cross-fertilize what you've just learned. And so ritual creates that properly done. And so ritually properly done, it means that in our Eucharist today, depending on your mindset and depending on your imagination and depending on your awareness, you can have as real an encounter with the risen Christ as did Peter or James or John or Mary of Magdala years ago. And I suggested to you that there are 3 ways of recognizing a Eucharistic encounter when you're looking at the life of Jesus. And in fact, this morning we were told, that there were 6 such encounters. The feeding of the 4,000, it's a Eucharistic encounter. It's fascinating to me that of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all have an account of the Last Supper. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke only devote a half a chapter each to the Last Supper. But mainly that half chapter is concerned with the Eucharist. John spends 5 chapters talking about the Last Supper, and he never mentions the institution of Eucharist. Isn't that weird? 5 chapters, he never mentions the institution of Eucharist. You have to look someplace else in John to recognize that Jesus is performing a Eucharistic ritual. You look in John chapter 6, where he's feeding the 5,000, and you look in John chapter 21, after his resurrection, when the fishermen are out at night and they see Jesus standing on the shore, and he brings them to shore and they have a meal. And the secret always is, there's always a code, there's a formula. Wherever you see, he took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed, you're in the presence of a Eucharistic encounter. And so the piece that Waven Dean read for us this morning, the account from Mark's Gospel, you see the exact same code. He took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. And all 6 accounts, of the multiplication of loaves are Eucharistic encounters, because you find the very same formula in each one of them. The same one you're going to find at the Last Supper, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is missing from John, except if you look in chapter 6 and chapter 21. So there are Eucharistic encounters all over the place. And so possibly the most important thing Jesus did as far as kind of educating us, in a sense, was that he went around the land of Israel throwing banquets. And I don't just mean ordinary meals. For an ordinary meal, people sat down or stood up. For a banquet, they reclined on their left elbow and they fed themselves with their right hand. So when you find people reclining at table, it's not a meal, it's a banquet. And the most important thing he did was throughout the land of Israel, throwing banquets to which everybody was invited, men, women and children, Jew and Gentile alike. So it was really, really upsetting to me as a priest that I was being told by the Roman Catholic Church that excommunication meant there were certain people, who couldn't be allowed to receive communion with us. That the very ritual of inclusivity that Jesus left us became the weapon of exclusivity. You can't allow a Protestant to receive communion. You can't allow a divorced and remarried Catholic to receive communion. You can't allow somebody who was in mortal sin, to receive communion. That the very ritual of inclusivity, where Christ is telling us every single one of you is a beloved child of God, and we're saying, no, we're going to use this ritual to exclude, and we'll tell you who's in and who's out. So that's what I had to say about Eucharist on March 7th. Last Sunday, then, I looked at the other sacrament from the Last Supper, the Sacrament of Priesthood. And I suggested that, there are various stages to this. That initially, I believe it was those who were present at the Last Supper who were priested and told, go and feed my people. So initially, it was this kind of a select group who were present at the Last Supper. But eventually these leaders were overtaxed. There were far too many duties to attend to. They were trying to preach the good news. They were trying to heal. And so they created all of these sub-ministries. And so eventually there are like 7 or 8, levels to priesthood. And I remember as a student in the seminary for 8 years, we didn't just wait for 8 years until the training was complete and then get ordained. We were being ordained at various stages. So the first stage was you got the ordination as a porter. And a porter literally meant a security guard, because initially during the house masses, they could be raided. So somebody needed to be careful about who was coming in and who was allowed in. So that was the porter. Next came the lector, the reader, because not everybody could read then. And these young Christian communities were exchanging letters with each other. So they needed somebody to be able to read to the group. So then there was ordination as a lector. Then came the acolyte, and the acolyte was somebody who was au fait with the ritual and could assist in the celebration of the ritual. Fourth came the exorcist, and this was a healer, the physician. When Christ said, he gave us 2 injunctions, preach good news and heal the sick. And so healing the sick meant being an exorcist, because the model of sickness was that all illness ultimately is of demonic origin. So you got to cast out the demons in order to heal anybody of physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual disorders. Then came the ministry of the diacon, being deacon. A deacon was basically a social worker, somebody tasked with delivering food to widows and orphans. And that became a major, major task. So big, in fact, that they had to have assistants, which are called sub-deacons. So they became 2 more stages of the road to priesthood, ordination to the subdiaconate, and then ordination to the diaconate, and then finally priesthood. So this was a person then who had permission to perform the entire ritual of the whole mass. So they were kind of the stages through which it went. I looked then at ministry throughout the ages, and I made the suggestion that, in my opinion, ministry consists of 4 aspects. There's a need in the community of some kind. There's somebody who volunteers to address that need. Then thirdly, that person is given training. And fourthly, the community commissions the person to act in that capacity on its behalf. So the 4 stages: a need, a volunteer, a training, and a commissioning. And wherever there is a need in the community, and you follow those 4 steps, you have a minister or a priest of some kind. And I did a quick look through history, looking at how in Europe particularly, that as different needs arose, different ministries were created. And so, for instance, agriculture was a ministry. In medieval and the dark ages of Europe, there was constant famine. And so it was the monks, the great monks in their monasteries, who developed agricultural practices which saved people from starvation. So the need was food, and the ministry was agriculture. You got the very same thing with education. The masses were uneducated, and so great orders of women, nuns of various kinds, and then brothers and sometimes priests, created the school system. It was the monks who created the university system of Europe, going way back into the 1300s, when the University of France was created. It was done by monks. So at every level, from 3rd level all the way down to the primary school, it was people responding to the need for education, creating new ministries. The same thing happened with healing ministries. And again, the women were to the forefront in this. The wise women, people like Hildegard von Bingen and other the Sisters of Mercy and the Sisters of Charity, who created hospitals, in response to illness. And in our times, I believe there's a new ministry evolving, which I would call the ministry of ecology. People who are dedicated to saving our planet from the pollution that we are creating. So there would be kind of stages of ministry throughout the ages. And then last Sunday, my main focus was, as I called it, woman as priest. And what I could see, obviously, was that in the early church, all masses were house masses. So many, many, many different communities, many of them led by really charismatic women who knew Jesus at a very, very deep personal level, like his mother or Mary of Magdala. So these were the leaders of the early Christian communities. But at some stage, they had to be edited out of the story. And I believe there was I pointed out a tiny little phrase you find in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 6, verse 7, and it's only half a verse, where you're told that many of the priests, of the Jewish priests, followed the Jesus movement. They joined the Jesus movement. And I'm thinking, oh, wait, brilliant. The priests are coming aboard. Now it's going to really take off. What happens, of course, is that when you get a kind of institutionalized priesthood taking over any renewal movement, here's what tends to happen. You get tradition being emphasized over innovation. You get dogma being emphasized over mysticism. You get legalism being emphasized over love, and you get hierarchy being emphasized over equality. And so, in an effort to try to gain respectability, the argument is, who is going to take us seriously in a patriarchal society if there are women in charge of religious ritual? That's a no-no. That can't fly anymore. And so now you begin the unraveling of what had been previously created. And it comes to a fruition finally, I believe, at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, when the emperor who called the council, it wasn't the Pope who called it, it was the emperor who called it. And at this stage, there's a final version of the scriptures being kind of redacted, and women are out of the picture completely. And I believe, I'm going to call it today, scriptural retro-editing began to happen. That they now go back to the accounts, the earlier accounts of the life of Jesus and the life of the young community, and they begin to redact it and re-edit it. And so women are written out even out of the Seder meal itself. And as I said last Sunday, a Seder meal without a woman would be like a labor ward without mothers. It is nonsensical that there would have been a Seder without women. It'd be trying to go into a labor ward and expect there to be no mothers present there. And so there were two reasons why they had to be written out of the Last Supper, because that's when Jesus institutes Eucharist and the ordination. And he said to everybody, do this in memory of me. Everybody present was being ordained for those two ministries. The third sacrament was okay. It was okay for women, to get the sacrament of service. That was okay. They could continue with that. They could be ministers of the sacrament of service, but not ministers of Eucharist or not ministers in priesthood. And so it doesn't make any sense to me that the single most feminine symbol that Jesus could have thought of on his exit from planet Earth, where he looked at all the mothers present at the Seder meal, and he created a symbol of feeding us from his own body and blood, which is precisely what his mother had done for him in utero, which is precisely what your mother did for you in utero, and as she breastfed you. So the single most important, symbol and sacrament, Eucharist, of feeding us from his own body and blood, is now being denied to women and given to male celibates eventually. It doesn't make any sense to me that his own mother, Mary, could handle his body at birth, and she could handle his body as she breastfed him, and she could even handle his body after he died and was taken down from the cross, and she's cradling the corpse of her dead son. She can handle his body on all those occasions, but she's not allowed to handle his consecrated host body in the Eucharist during Mass. Doesn't make any sense to me. And then you have this schizophrenic attitude developing in Christianity and in Roman Catholicism particularly, where we almost divinize Mary. She's almost a god, but she can't be a priest. And the final point I made last week was, I talked about a post-gender priesthood. So I believe that the function of the priest is to be, I'm going to call it a veil piercer. We got a phrase in Ireland, Irish, called Acolyte, a thin place. A thin place is an area, a geographical location in which the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous, between the sacred and the secular. Now, this can actually be a physical location, a geographical location. It can also be a time. There are thin times like Samhain or Bealtaine or Lunasa or Imbolc for the Celts. So there can be thin times, and there can even be thin people. And I'm not talking about their weight. I'm talking about the fact that there are people whom I would call mobile tabernacles of the sacred, a Jesus figure, a Buddha figure, maybe a Mahatma Gandhi figure, or a Mother Teresa figure, or a Martin Luther King, that they carry with them, the ability to allow people to see beyond the merely secular into the sacred. And so in some senses, that's what a priest means. A priesthood is a person who can carry that kind of energy with her. Somebody who can show the mystical reality behind the illusion of the merely physical. And anybody who is willing and able to do that, as far as I'm concerned, is a priest. It doesn't take a hierarchy cannot do that to that for you. A hierarchy, a bishop can't impose hands on you and give you that ability. That comes from your own soul, and it comes from the community. So anybody who has the ability and the willingness to be a veil piercer, to be a mobile tabernacle of the diaphanous veil between the mystical and the mundane, that person is a priest. With that kind of Christ consciousness, to quote Paul, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female. So let's open it up, guys.
Is anything changing in other churches, Catholicism and other Christian churches, about the understanding of Eucharist. You picture this as being, how on earth does this make sense?
Right.
And yet it's kind of been fixed for 2,000 years. Do you see change in the world in an understanding of it?
So I see two aspects to it, Lawrence. Firstly is, whether or not women are entitled to be priests, and then understanding what does Eucharist actually mean. So in some senses, the Protestants are way ahead of the Catholics when it comes to allowing women to be priests. They got there way ahead of us. But as far as the understanding of Eucharist, they're way behind us. So let me deal with those two separately. There have been Christian denominations which long ago have recognized the fact that it is ludicrous to make gender, a necessary criterion for priesthood. It's absolutely ludicrous. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so there have been many Protestant denominations, even significant ones like the Episcopalian, or the Church of England, which are allowing this, women to be even bishops, not just priests. And so in that sense, the Protestants have been way ahead of the Catholic. They're way behind the Catholic in the sense of their understanding of Eucharist, because for many of these denominations, Eucharist is merely a memorial, that you're remembering a time 2,000 years ago, 6,000 or miles to the east of us, if we live in the United States, where a bunch of people got into an upper room and created a ritual, and now we're harkening back to that and say, well, that must have been a great occasion. So it's just a memorial, like you celebrate, July 4th, from when in 1776, we declared our independence, but it's only a memorial. It's not happening right now. So that's where they're way behind, because the Catholic understanding, particularly as I'm articulating at least, is that a Eucharistic encounter is a real encounter with the risen Christ. And it's dependent upon the realization that time is an artifact of human consciousness. When you really get that, when you manage to step outside of this kind of ordinary state of consciousness, time does not exist. Everything is present in the now. It's a question of merely selecting from the possibilities. It's what quantum mechanics is telling us, that it is the observing consciousness that collapses the wave of possibilities down to the outcome, the specific outcome. It is your intention and your attention that, collapses in some senses, or selects out from all those existing possibilities, the reality in which you're encountering the risen Christ in a Eucharistic banquet. And so I think Catholics managed to get that. Well, most Catholics got some level of that. Maybe we haven't fully appreciated it, but most Catholics believe that when you put the host on somebody's tongue, you're actually receiving the body and blood of Jesus. Except the mistake most of them make, that it's like, if this is Jesus, then there must be a kidney in there somewhere and a big toe in there someplace, thinking that somehow, that the physical piece of bread actually contains the totality of a man who walked, a carpenter 2,000 years ago. So that they don't understand that piece, that the encounter is taking place at a totally different level of consciousness. It's an encounter between the etheric or the soul body of Christ and your own soul body. It's not just merely an encounter between your physical tongue, and somebody, a carcass of somebody who died 2,000 years ago. It is not that. The physical thing is a symbol. I said there's 1 foot in the symbol has 1 foot in physicality and 1 foot in the metaphysical. The physical component is the piece of bread that you're receiving. The metaphysical is the fact that it shifts your state of consciousness, so that from all the pre-existing possibilities, you can select out one in which you're having a real encounter with the risen Christ. So in one sense, Catholics are way ahead of the pack, and the other, they're way behind the pack.
You said something that I've never really thought about before, but that ritual helps activate consciousness. And I never put all that together. And I know as a kid, I remember sitting and squirming as a little kid. I get yelled at when my parents came back from communion, because you're just like, and even as I got older, it wasn't until I was much older that I felt this happening. And I don't think that less and less people are attending services over time. I don't really need religion. I don't need this. I don't need that. And I just see this as a real loss, where people, I don't have to go to church, and I'm sure that people can create this in their own home, but especially in this pandemic time, it's probably missing for a lot of people. And how does, the whole, our society help regain this? I mean, this is a terrible loss, to think that people cannot experience this, or they're just shoveling it off, you know. I'm saying,
That's
oh,
a
it
great
doesn't matter. I
question.
don't need.
Yeah, great question, John. And so part of the problem is that, you know, ritual has been degraded. You know, even when you look at the celebration of Mass, it just be really upsetting to me that you could go to Mass and be all over and done within 25 minutes. You know, there's priests rushing through the service in Latin, basically, you know, jabbing a piece of communion into your mouth like it was a Pez dispenser. And so the whole ritual itself was totally counterproductive. It was creating nothing by way of altered states of consciousness. So a total inability to understand what good ritual actually does. And there are several components. Great ritual has to do with, it has to feed all of the sensorium. And so a great ritual, like say a high mass at some stage in which there's incense. So, you know, olfactorily, you're being stimulated. You know, visually, you're looking at the stained glass windows, you know, or the vestments that the priest is wearing. You're looking at, you know, tasting bread and wine. So a gustatory experience. You're listening to great music. You know, so every one of the senses is being engaged, but that's gone out the window now. So you've got a little ritual that's over and done with in 25 minutes. It's about Sunday obligation. It's not about an encounter with the risen Christ. And what we don't realize is that people thirst for ritual. We create ritual in all kinds of places. Anybody who watched the Super Bowl, you know, a few Sundays ago, that is a ritual which creates an altered state of consciousness. You know, when crowds were allowed to attend, there'd be, I don't know, 80, 90,000 people screaming their heads off in totally altered states of consciousness, feeling that they could actually influence the outcome of a particular play by shouting loudly enough. So that's what great ritual does. It creates an altered state of consciousness. But we've lost the ability very, very often to create really, really good ritual. And so we're forcing people to, you know, go to Mass because it's a Sunday obligation. And since it's not feeding people, why would they go back there? So it's about recreating ritual. And that's dependent upon not just the ministers, not just the music person, you know, or not just the readers, or not just the priest, but everybody who's in attendance. How much are you prepared to invest, you know, by way of preparation and imagination to make this a real ritual for everybody present, so that when you're in physical proximity to other people, that you're actually generating an energy which is changing everybody. We know from studies, for instance, on meditation, that the brain creates wavelengths. And when people meditate together, their wavelengths, their wave synchronizes. So if you get two sine waves, you know, which are coordinated properly, they'll double each other's amplitude. If they're in dissonance with each other, they'll cancel each other out. So when you get a whole bunch of people coming together with the same wavelength, the same kind of imaginative understanding of Eucharist, and they're together as a community in love, then you amplify the wave and everybody present has a deeper and deeper experience. So that's what real ritual should be doing, but mostly it's not.
Yeah, Seán, I went to Catholic high school in the early 50s. And what I was taught about sacraments, and it's particularly relevant with respect for me to the Eucharist, was that sacraments were a sacred ritual which provided grace to everybody who participated in them. And it did not make it was unimportant what I brought to the sacrament, because the sacrament provided that really did terrible things to me, because I brought nothing to Holy Communion. And, you know, I always wondered for years and years and years why I got so little from receiving the Eucharist. I now have a different mindset, but I'm still trying to bring more to the Eucharist than just my body and not being in mortal sin, because that's a whole nother. And it's sort of a comment about how that way of looking at a sacrament, and in particular the Eucharist, really could be of such a great disservice to people, or was such a great disservice to me. And, you know, I think your alternative view, whatever you want to call it, has been very, very helpful for a number of years. But I still have a lot to overcome. Great observation, Tom. And you're absolutely right. The idea that Eucharist was a magical rite
where a priest took a piece of bread, said, Hoc est enim corpus meum, and suddenly there was Jesus on the altar. And when you received it, no matter what your mindset was, you have an encounter with Jesus. That's a totally reductionistic model of an extraordinarily complex, spiritual reality. And so what you're saying is absolutely right. The reception of Eucharist is on a spectrum from nothing to infinity, depending on the mindset and the awareness that I bring to the encounter. So Jesus is as present and only as present to a Eucharistic encounter as the recipient is to the Eucharistic encounter. That's the totality of it. What you bring to it, is what happens. What you don't bring to it never happens. And so we have to learn how to kind of sharpen our abilities, to engage with the process. And imagination is a powerful way of doing that, as I'm defining imagination, not fantasy, but the ability to shift my state of consciousness, realize that time is a phenomenon of just incarnational thinking, but it doesn't exist outside that. And so by shifting, having real encounters, literally from the quantum mechanics, I can select out all the pre-existing possibilities that are concurrently present and choose the one that I want to experience. And I do that through my own mindset. So hats off to you, Tom.
My question is related to Johannes. In this notion that you've talked about before, where the lawmakers are responsible for the breaking of the law. Right. And it seems to me, when it became a mortal sin not to attend Mass, right, that was the beginning of the end. Right. That people, and in order to get compliance, they had to back off to say, oh, you don't have to be there for the liturgy of the word. You can come in at the offertory and walk out the door straight from communion. And so there's no, ritual approach of the Holy of the Holies, right? There's nothing. And so it becomes meaningless to people. Right. And so they don't come. Right. So it's like they've shot themselves in the foot by continually trying to make it easier to comply with something that has no more meaning. Right.
You're absolutely right. So what I've seen happen is that the sacrament has been reduced to a symbol, and then we have a symbol of a symbol. It's not even the original symbol anymore. It's a symbol of a symbol. Like for instance, the priest symbolically washing his fingers during Eucharist in a tiny little bowl, putting his fingers in and washing it. Where originally, when people came, there'd be foot washing, which Jesus did at the Last Supper. So having traveled in dusty roads, they'd have dirty feet. So you take off your shoes and wash your feet, so as a symbol of, the fact that you're going to have a kind of a transcendent experience. So we have sacraments reduced to symbols, and symbols reduced to symbols of symbols of symbols of symbols. So we're so far away even from the symbol value of it anymore, it doesn't make any sense to anybody else. And then you tack on punitive measures like, you're going to go to hell if you miss Mass on Sunday, or eat sausages on a Friday. And so people now are going to attend a boring ritual because they're afraid of going to hell. So we're there for all the wrong reasons. And the priests are there for all the wrong reasons. I remember there was a big church in Cork City called St. Patrick's Church, and it was right next to the railway station. And on Sundays, when Cork was a very, very good hurling and football team, when they'd be playing very important matches in, say, Dublin or Limerick, and we'd have to go there by train, you could go to St. Patrick's, on a Sunday morning, and you want to catch the train immediately afterwards. And literally, the priest would go through the entire Mass, I'm not joking you, in 15 minutes flat. That's everything from talking out, Ita Missa Est, 15 minutes. And before he'd finished saying Ita Missa Est, we were out the back door running for the train to go to Dublin. So that's what became of it. So neither the priests nor the people understood what it was about. And we just watered it and diluted it down finally until it's a meaningless symbol of a symbol of a symbol of a sacrament. And then we have to attend, otherwise we're going to go to hell. So you put your finger right on it. It needs to be rethought, a totally different understanding of what this extraordinary ritual can achieve.
Yeah, it seems to me people they're being deprived of the experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Why would they come back?
Exactly. Yeah.
I just can't seem to get this notion out of my head. I mean, you talked about how women weren't and still aren't allowed to be priests. They're not allowed to lead the Eucharist. and the continued perception of women as the weaker gender, who aren't allowed to do a lot of things and who are also exposed to all kinds of abuse, and even women themselves allowing them to be in abuse, be in that situation. And I just wonder, how does the ritual of Eucharist and the celebration of Eucharist address sort of that? I mean, I'm trying to connect how that can change maybe with the celebration of the Eucharist.
Great question. So when you look at it historically, at the evolution of religions on our planet, I believe that all religions begin with a mystical impulse, but very, very quickly they're hijacked by organizations and institutions and orthodoxies, and of various kinds. So initially you have two different models of religion, what are called the ascending models of religion and the descending models of religion. Descending models of religion are very feminine because they're earth-based, they're nature-based, they're celebrating nature and celebrating nurturance. And so religions in which women are leaders very, very often have to do with honoring, the divine in nature. Men have a different mindset very often. It's an ascending mindset that men tend to operate more out of the head. So they operate more out of a transcendent notion of God. So you've got two aspects of God in a sense. There's the transcendence of God about which we can say nothing. It is basically an ineffable reality. And then there's the immanence of God. God as she reveals herself through her creation, like nature. So men tend to focus on elevating the consciousness in order to encounter the transcendent, and women have tended traditionally to focus on the earthing and grounding of the immanence of God. And so you got this, two totally different agendas going on here. Now the Star of David is very, very interesting because it's the combination of these two symbols. If you take two triangles and superimpose them on each other, you get the Star of David. And that's the ideal, that you have the feminine and the masculine together, working together. But when you have, the denunciation of the feminine in order to reach for the transcendent, then women and what they represent are going to get downgraded. So what happens in Eucharist, to get the second part of your question? How can the Eucharist, deal with this reality? It has to do with the formula. Listen again what Jesus does every time. He took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. What does taking mean? It means Jesus looked at nature and he realized that everything he was wearing and everything he was eating and everything he was breathing was a gift from Pachamama. And therefore taking it wasn't grabbing it. It wasn't a pillage of the resources. It was the grateful receiving of that which Mother Earth was giving. So that's totally feminine right there. Then he blessed it. And blessing is not the imparting of benediction to a previously inert substance. It's not like you make the sign of the cross over a piece of bread and suddenly it elevates, what the bread is. Blessing is the recognition of the inherent sanctity of that which you're receiving from Mother Earth. There again is totally feminine. It's the gratitude of recognizing the inherent sanctity of that which Mother Nature is giving us. The third piece then is breaking. Now we're talking about the male part of it. We're talking about creating models for the equal distribution of the world's resources. So figuring out ways in which these resources can be made available to everybody on the planet. And then the fourth one would be another male aspect. It would be the distribution process itself, making sure that the resources actually get to where they're intended. So right within the Eucharist itself, you have this extraordinary overlapping and complementarity of the feminine and the masculine aspects. So a Eucharist properly understood, with just those four words. He took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. There is the full integration of the feminine and the masculine faces of God. There's the full integration of ascending religions and descending religions. There's the full integration of the feminine impulse and the masculine impulse, dancing together as lovers, not battling each other as adversaries.
Since the pandemic, we haven't been able to attend physical masses. Right. We are in this Eucharist. We are all together in different places, in different times, but in all together in the virtual reality.
Absolutely.
We are not in the physical reality,
Right.
but in the virtual reality. If I want to attend Mass tomorrow morning, Monday, I will switch in my computer to a YouTube Mass celebrated physically in some place in Spain at 2 o'clock in my time. And they tell me that I'm going to receive a spiritual communion. You make that spiritual communion.
Okay.
What does it? I have two questions.
Right.
First, how has the virtual reality transformed our being together in the same consciousness state? And the second one is, what's the meaning of that spiritual communion, which is something less than a physical communion? When I will be able, I will have a physical communion.
Right.
Now I have to be, well, it will suffice to me to have a spiritual communion.
Right. They're great, great questions. So you've asked actually 3 questions right in the middle of that, Germán. The first one is you came to the realization that we're in different physical spaces and we're in different time zones. You're in Oaxaca now, and you haven't changed your clocks yet. You know, there's a Joan Corrigan is here from Newfoundland. And so we're in different time regions and different physical locations. That's precisely what I'm saying. When you step into a spiritual reality, location and time don't exist anymore. We're all present in the now. So these are artificial constructs. And so in some senses, the Zoom masses are actually waking us up to the realization that geographical distance and temporal distance are meaningless. That is the consciousness which is present. So to get to your second 2 questions then, what does it mean then to receive spiritual communion? Every time you receive mindfully, whether you're in a physical building receiving a physical host, or you're doing it, on a Zoom, depending on your awareness, you're having a spiritual encounter with Jesus. Has nothing got to do with the fact that you're feeling a piece of bread on your tongue, or you're just watching somebody do it in Madrid. That doesn't make any difference. Somebody on a Zoom Mass who has a level of awareness is receiving Jesus more really than somebody who is physically present in a building and that they're thinking about what they're going to have for their lunch. So it's your mindset that creates this spiritual encounter. So a spiritual Eucharist is the only kind of Eucharist that exists. And whether that happens in a physical encounter in a physical church, or it happens because you're taking bread in your own home and you are consecrating it by your mindset and then receiving it, that's as powerful an experience of Jesus as if you were in a kind of a cathedral in Madrid receiving it from the Archbishop. You are the one creating the Eucharistic encounter, Germán.
Father Seán, I guess, all questions somehow merge and respond themselves. And, in this celebration, this is really interesting how your answer to the last one somehow creates bridges that this experience into what we can make it into. And my question pertains to something that Tom alluded to earlier, and is that as a child, I went to Catholic school, and the model that I was served was very hard to absorb and take without a strong sense of fear and inadequacy on my part.
Yes.
So this with time just created a huge gap that made it very challenging for me to consider. The notion of belief became so important with time for me that I would like you to address a little bit of this notion of belief, because I feel that belief is like the door to be able to experience any of this. Without it, we would be all somehow left at the door with this skepticism. Okay. So I guess my question is conviction the main way to create presence for this, to make your life into a Eucharistic moment, so to speak, to address this possibility as immediate all the time?
That's a brilliant question, Herman. Brilliant question. And so in some senses, it's not a question of belief. Belief is a matter of the intellect. So very, very often when you hear about credo, like the Nicene Creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, etc. These creedal formulations were like a kind of the passport to get entry to the kingdom of heaven. You had to believe A and B and C and D. No great teacher ever asks anybody to believe anything, ever. They don't insist on orthodoxy. They insist on orthopraxis. Orthodoxy means, beliefs that, concur with the mind of the organization. So orthodoxy has to do with, the same teaching, right teaching, literally from the Greek, it means right teaching, or right believing. Orthopraxis is right action, living your life in accordance with divine precept. And so the teachers always ask for orthopraxy. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. They never ask you to believe in anything. And any kind of part of the scriptures which insist on belief, they've been manipulated subsequently to bring you into conformity with decrees from councils that happened 400 and 500 and 600 years after Jesus had died. So it is what is in your heart. So it's not credo, it's cordo. And you should understand this, obviously, as a Spanish speaker, how close these are. Credo means to give intellectual assent to some proposition. Cordo means to give your heart to something. So it's the difference between belief and trust. When a little infant is born and is placed on its mother's breast, it's not there because it made an active belief, a kind of an intellectual kind of assent. Yes, I believe that there's going to be a woman with milk and a breast and arms to cuddle me. The child just trusts that's going to be there. It's not an intellectual assent, it's the trust that this is how things work. There's always be a mother with milk, and arms to hug. And that's our relationship with God. I believe that the entire cosmic journey from the Big Bang to the Big Crunch, whenever that's going to happen, is a single safari that began in God's womb and ends on God's heart. The very same way that the journey of a little baby begins in utero, in the mother's womb, as a little zygote, and it ends when it's born and placed on her breast and is now suckling right next to her heart. That's the journey of a kind of gestation. And the gestation of the entire universe is the same thing. It's a single journey from God's womb to God's heart. And what that asks of us is not belief systems, it's trust. And the trust allows us then to formulate cosmologies. And these cosmologies have to be our own cosmology. A cosmology is a model that allows you to make sense of every experience you're having in your life and gives you the tools to become a more and more loving person. So a cosmology that can't explain the experiences you're having is an inadequate cosmology. It has to be tweaked again and again and again. And therefore a cosmology that talks about heaven and hell, that you're going to go to hell for all eternity for eating a sausage on a Friday or missing Mass on a Sunday, that's a pathetic cosmology. That's one that needs to be discarded. And so the journey of the human being is to keep developing personal cosmologies based on trust in the mother who conceived us, carried us, birthed us, and is nurturing us. That's the cosmology. That's where we need to go. And if you can engage your mind and your imagination and your heart and your body and your intuition in that process, great. Engage all the parts. But don't just think that it's a belief system that's going to get you there. Belief systems don't get you to heaven.
Yeah, I wanted to return to the topic that we were discussing earlier about ritual and the meaning of ritual. And for me, I think I have kind of a short attention span. So if I have to do something 2 or 3 times, more than 2 or 3 times the same way, I tend to become unconscious and just do it mechanically. And so I always kind of think of ritual as being dead ritual. But at the same time, I do believe there's this extraordinary power in collective consciousness when it's in sync. So I'm just wondering if there is some way that we can make it fresh each time when we go through the ritual, or something I can do to kind of bring a fresh, novel perspective on it in the moment, rather than just mechanically going through the motions.
That's a great point that you're making, Bill. So obviously there's a stage at which a repeated action loses its ability to engage your consciousness, and we call that can be either called boredom or it can be called the beginning of a mantra. A mantra is precisely the repetition of a phrase that elevates the consciousness away beyond thought forms into a place where you're dancing with the mystical. And so, properly understood, a ritualistic, formulaic, prayer can become a mantra. And the function of the mantra then is not to allow you to cognitively kind of exegete it each time you engage with it, but rather to transcend cognition completely and to allow the ritual and the repetition of the ritual to precipitate an altered state of consciousness in which the ritual becomes a mantra that just changes your state of consciousness, and then you're free to soar. Then you're free to use your imagination to go when you will or where you will.
I wanted to piggyback on a couple of things that were said. One is the spiritual communion idea. The church, the Catholic Church right now has a universal spiritual communion, they say, after communion is distributed. And I've been wanting to write to somebody to say, I disagree with you, because it says, since I cannot receive you sacramentally, come at least spiritually into my heart. And that means that he's not there, so he leaves. So when did he leave? So I have to go every Sunday that he comes back again? That's what I want to write to the new bishop. Anyway.
Good luck on that one, Margaret.
Yeah. And the other one is, having grown up in Ireland, like you did, I often wonder that everything we learned, and I shouldn't wonder because I know, everything we learned about our faith and the sacraments and everything was all head knowledge. If you knew the answers to the catechism, you're a good Catholic. You never delved into the experience of what anything meant. And I don't think those who taught us knew that. I think they were formed, and they were formed, and they were formed. So it was just a sin of omission for the generations.
Absolutely. I agree totally with you. The whole notion that somehow now the Catholic Church has the ability, the God-given right to say that even though you can't be physically present, we're going to create a situation in which you can spiritually receive. Why couldn't you spiritually receive 40 years ago before there was a pandemic if you wanted to stay home on a Sunday morning? Why couldn't they kind of telecommunicate the Eucharist to you at that stage? Because it has nothing got to do with, the actual encounter with Christ. It has everything to do with control and power of the organizations and people's livelihoods. So the Catholic Church is now responding to a situation in which they're still attempting to be in charge of your spirituality and tell you, well, by a special dispensation, we'll allow you to spiritually receive Jesus, even though you can't sacramentally receive him. It's total balderdash. Your reception, your encounter with Jesus Christ has never been dependent upon an institution or a physical encounter. It depended completely on the state of awareness of your soul when it encounters a particular ritual or mantra.
They have this thing on a Hawaiian Airlines called the Puanani Club, right? It's a special club you can join, and it gives you 2 free bags to check so you don't have to pay for them. Is there anything like this with this program that you could sign up for a membership and get a couple of benefits where you don't have to do the karma and free bags?
Yeah, it's called indulgences, but you have to send money to Rome to build St. Peter's again.
I see. Is there anything more local maybe? Or
the most local thing of all are individual friendships, Waven. The people in your life already, Elizabeth, your 2 sons, your Auntie Lorraine, when you go back to Hilo in Hawaii. They're your free bags. They are the place in which, by interpersonal contact, that you're going to help raise each other's consciousness. So we all get free bags.
Part of my question that I didn't remember to say was, how do we help people return to ritual? We're here on this Zoom Mass. There are people sitting in churches and on other Zoom Masses. There's other people who it's either never entered or it's never entered properly. my goddaughter, she has a little baby, and I said to her, are you going to baptize the baby? Or I didn't even say that. I said to her, if you've never called out to God or prayed to God, then don't bother baptizing your child. But if you have, think about it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that she ever did. She said something about, well, she lives in New York. I went to these huge masses in these huge buildings, these huge ceremonies. She liked that. I guess that's an altering of consciousness that can occur. But how do we help people return to ritual who aren't here now with us?
Okay.
You know?
So, two things to respond to that, Johanna. The first one is that we're not here to proselytize anybody. You know, if we are engaged in conversation with people and topics come up and we can make a contribution, that's one way of doing it in person. The other thing is by changing the consciousness of a community, we begin to change the consciousness of the planet itself. That literally every thought, every word, and every action is radiating out into the very universe itself. And so everything we do is affecting everybody else. Now, the same thing is true of the mass murderer or the serial killer. You know, he's continuing to kind of infuse, you know, the energy of the planet with a very different kind of life form. And so until there's a kind of a critical mass reached, you know, we're going to see the kind of the darkness be in charge. So it means that small communities like ourselves, and for me, it's important that there be small communities. I've said before, I think I said during the retreat, that any community which goes over about 150 members becomes problematic. Because the essence of community must be that everybody in the community knows everybody in the community. And that's why we insisted at CIJ, you know, and you've been there since the beginning, that we spend about a half an hour every Sunday morning giving everybody in the church the opportunity to interface with everybody else in the church. There was nobody in the church who wasn't known to everybody in the church. So a stranger came in, we made our way, make sure that everybody got to greet this person, because we were trying to create community, not just create Sunday obligation. Now, when you get over 150 people, it's very difficult to maintain that level of personal contact. So it has to be like a global brain, individual neurons of 150 members, you know, creating dendrites and axons, connecting with other neurons, other communities throughout the world. And they don't have to be Eucharistic communities. They can be people who are interested in ecology. They can be people who are interested in the welfare of the dolphins. It doesn't matter what they are. People who are interested in raising their consciousness. When they connect together, there's an extraordinary ability for that to change the global brain of planet Earth. So we can do it in individual encounters if the opportunity arises, but much more importantly, you know, by finding little communities like this or others, you know, and trying to help each other to raise our consciousness, and therefore in that sense, to propagate that new level of frequency.